Hey, before we dive in today, I want you to think about someone you know over the age of 60. A parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, maybe even yourself. Now hold that person in your mind, because what I'm about to share with you over the next 20 minutes genuinely has the potential to protect them, and maybe protect you. Parkinson's disease? Most people, when they hear that name, they picture an elderly person with a tremor. They think, that's a sad disease, but it's rare. It happens to old people. It's just part of aging. And I'm here to tell you today that almost everything in that mental picture is wrong. Parkinson's is no longer rare. It has become the fastest growing brain disease on the planet. And more importantly, it is largely preventable. So let's talk about it. Welcome back, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. If you're new to this channel, I'm a functional medicine physician. And what that means, essentially, is that instead of just treating disease symptoms after they show up, I'm obsessed with figuring out why disease happens in the first place. The root causes, the upstream factors. And Parkinson's disease? It is one of the most compelling and honestly, one of the most alarming examples of why that root cause approach matters so deeply right now. Today, I want to walk you through 5 truths about Parkinson's that most people, including a lot of doctors, don't fully understand. These aren't fringe ideas. They're coming out of rigorous research from scientists like Dr. Ray Dorsey at the University of Rochester and Dr. Michael Oken at the University of Florida, 2 of the most respected Parkinson's researchers in the world. So first, let me just set the stage with some numbers, because I think they need to land for people. When we adjust for age, because the population is getting older, and we need to account for that, the incidence of Parkinson's disease has increased by 60% in recent decades. 60%. That is not a small statistical blip. That is a dramatic exponential rise. And if we continue on this current trajectory, by the year 2035, that's less than 10 years away, roughly 12 million people worldwide will be living with Parkinson's disease. 12 million. That makes it not just a neurological problem, that makes it a public health emergency. Now compare that to Alzheimer's disease, which I know gets an enormous amount of attention and funding, rightfully so. But here's the thing. Parkinson's is actually growing faster than Alzheimer's. It is outpacing Alzheimer's in its rate of expansion. Yet it receives a fraction of the research funding and public awareness. And this is something that I find genuinely troubling, because unlike many diseases, we now have a very compelling body of evidence suggesting that Parkinson's, for the most part, is not just an inevitable consequence of getting old. It is, in large part, an environmental disease, an industrial disease, which means it is, theoretically, preventable. Dr. Mark Hyman, who has written extensively about this, uses an analogy I find incredibly powerful. He calls the explosion of Parkinson's a canary in the industrial coal mine. You know the old story. Miners used to carry canaries into the mine shafts with them because the birds were more sensitive to toxic gases. If the canary died, that was the warning signal. Get out now. Parkinson's, in this framing, is our canary. It is our biological warning system, telling us that something about the modern industrial environment has become fundamentally incompatible with human biology. So let's look at what's actually driving this. And I want to start with what I think is the most foundational shift in how we understand this disease. Okay, so truth number 1, and this is a big one. Parkinson's is not, I repeat, not just a brain disease. It is a whole body crisis. Now I know that might sound strange, because for decades we have defined Parkinson's almost entirely by what happens in the brain. Specifically, the death of dopamine-producing neurons in a region of the brain called the substantia nigra. When those neurons die, you lose dopamine signaling, and you get the classic symptoms: the tremor, the rigidity, the slowness of movement, the the postural instability. That's the textbook. And the textbook is correct, but it is wildly incomplete. What we now know is that Parkinson's is driven by misfolded proteins, specifically a protein called alpha-synuclein. And when this protein misfolds, it starts behaving like a kind of biological domino, triggering other proteins to misfold, spreading through tissue, accumulating in clumps called Lewy bodies. Now here's the thing that should change how you think about Parkinson's forever. These misfolded proteins are found in the gut, the skin, and the heart long before they ever reach the brain. Years before, sometimes decades before. I like to use the analogy of a fitted sheet. You know, the kind you put on a mattress, with the elastic corners. When it's folded correctly, it works perfectly. When it's folded incorrectly, which, let's be honest, happens to all of us, it gets tangled, it bunches up, it causes problems. That's what alpha-synuclein does when it misfolds. It tangles, it causes problems, and it starts not in your brain, but in your body. And the data backs this up in some fascinating ways. For example, people with Parkinson's disease have twice the risk of melanoma. That's skin cancer. They also have significantly elevated rates of osteoporosis. If this were purely a brain disease, why would it affect the skin and the bones? But it does, because the underlying pathology is systemic. This is also why we now talk about what's called prodromal Parkinson's. Prodromal just means before the main disease shows up. There are early warning signs that can appear 10, 15, even 20 years before a tremor ever develops. And I want to go through these because I think this is life-changing information. The first one is REM sleep behavior disorder. This is when someone acts out their dreams physically, kicking, punching, yelling in their sleep. Not just restless sleep, actually physically acting out the content of dreams. Studies show this can precede Parkinson's by more than a decade. The second early sign is chronic constipation. I know that's not a glamorous topic, but it is enormously important. If the gut-brain connection is involved early in the disease process, and the evidence strongly suggests it is, then gut symptoms are going to show up first. The third early sign is loss of smell. The medical term is hyposmia. Foods don't smell as strong. You can't detect subtle scents. This happens because the olfactory bulb, the part of your brain responsible for smell, is one of the earliest areas affected by misfolded proteins. And the fourth early warning sign is new onset anxiety in middle age. Not anxiety that you've always had, but anxiety that starts appearing in your 40s or 50s without an obvious psychological cause. Now, I want to be very clear. Having one of these symptoms does not mean you have Parkinson's, but it does mean it's worth paying attention to and discussing with your doctor. And this brings me to something Dr. Michael Oken said that really stuck with me. We often think of the blood-brain barrier, the protective membrane around the brain, as essentially a force field, like the brain is this heavily fortified fortress and nothing can get in. Dr. Oken says, that's not right. The blood-brain barrier is far more permeable than we were taught. And this matters enormously when we start talking about environmental toxins, which is exactly where we're going next. Okay, truth number 2. And I love this one because it takes us on a bit of a historical journey. Dr. Ray Dorsey has done some fascinating work tracing the origins of Parkinson's disease. And what he found is that Parkinson's has what he calls a virtual birth certificate, dated 1817. That's the year a British physician named Dr. James Parkinson published his landmark paper describing this disease for the very first time. And in that paper, he described just 6 cases, 6, in the whole of London. Before the rise of industrialization, Parkinson's disease was so extraordinarily rare that it barely existed in medical literature. The disease as we know it today, this epidemic, essentially did not exist before the Industrial Revolution. Now think about what 1817 London looked like. It was a city thick with coal soot. There was mercury in the air, lead in the water, heavy metals everywhere. The skies were orange and toxic. Actually, not entirely unlike the skies we saw over New York City during the Canadian wildfires a couple of years ago, or what people in cities like Delhi breathe on a daily basis. And here's the mechanism, because I know you want to know how this works, not just that it works. One of the key entry points for environmental toxins into the brain is the olfactory nerve, the nerve responsible for your sense of smell. This nerve is unique because it is essentially a direct neural highway from the outside world into the brain. It bypasses the blood-brain barrier almost entirely. The nose acts like a front door. And what can walk through that front door? Particulate matter, tiny particles in polluted air. We're talking about particles less than 1/30th the width of a human hair. They're invisible to the naked eye. You breathe them in, and you don't even know it. And hitching rides on these particles are industrial metals. Lead, historically from leaded gasoline, which was in widespread use until the 1970s and 80s. Iron from brake dust. Platinum from catalytic converters in cars. These metals are neurotoxic, and they have a direct pipeline into the brain's most sensitive centers via the olfactory pathway. This is a genuinely disturbing picture, and it explains something that really bothers me as a physician: the 25-year lag. In medicine, we know that there's often a significant delay between an exposure and the development of the disease. We saw this with cigarette smoking and lung cancer. People smoked in their 20s and 30s, and lung cancer showed up in their 50s and 60s. The same dynamic is playing out with Parkinson's. The exposures happening to people today, the pollution they breathe, the pesticides they encounter, may not manifest as Parkinson's for 25 years or more. And there is no more haunting example of this than Camp Lejeune. This was a U.S. Marine Corps base where, for decades, the drinking water was contaminated with a dry cleaning chemical called TCE, trichloroethylene. Marines who were exposed to that contaminated water at age 20 had a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease 34 years later. 34 years. Think about that. These were young, healthy, fit servicemen and women, and the exposure they experienced as 20-year-olds was silently working in the background for over 3 decades before Parkinson's emerged. This is why I keep saying, Parkinson's is not an old person disease, it's a disease with old exposures. All right, truth number 3. This one gets into some really interesting mechanistic science around how Parkinson's actually travels through the body. And researchers have identified what they're calling 2 primary highways for the disease. The first is the nose-first pathway. This is what I was just describing. Inhaled toxicants, whether that's air pollution or aerially sprayed pesticides, enter through the nose, access the olfactory bulb, and from there move directly into the brain. The second is the gut-first pathway. This involves toxicants that you ingest, pesticide residues on food or contaminated water, that enter through the digestive system and interact with what's called the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system is sometimes called the second brain. It's this enormous network of neurons lining your entire gastrointestinal tract, about 100 million neurons, and it communicates constantly with your brain through the vagus nerve. Now, in the gut-first model of Parkinson's, what happens is this: misfolded proteins begin accumulating in the gut, and then they travel, slowly, steadily, upward toward the brain via the vagus nerve. Picture a row of dominoes falling. Each one knocks over the next, slowly, relentlessly. By the time this pathological process reaches the brainstem, which is further along in the progression, it has already been quietly causing damage in the gut for years. And this is why chronic constipation is one of the earliest symptoms. The gut is being affected first. This 2-highway model is really important for a couple of reasons. First, It helps explain why some people develop Parkinson's in slightly different patterns and sequences. Second, it gives us potential intervention points, places where if we can identify the disease early enough, we might be able to slow or even stop the progression. It also reinforces something I cannot emphasize enough. If you have unexplained gastrointestinal issues, loss of smell, or sleep disturbances, especially all three together, please mention it to your doctor. These are not trivial complaints. They may be early signals of something that needs attention. Okay, truth number 4. And I have to warn you, this one is going to feel counterintuitive, maybe even a little uncomfortable. Living within 1 mile of a golf course increases your risk of developing Parkinson's disease by 126%. Let that sit for a second. 126%. From living near a golf course. Now, obviously, it's not the golf itself. It's not the walking, the fresh air, or the sport. It's the chemicals required to keep those manicured green fairways looking the way they do. 2 pesticides in particular are at the center of this story. The first is paraquat. Paraquat is a herbicide, a weed killer. It has been banned in over 30 countries. The European Union banned it years ago. Switzerland, China, Brazil, all banned. Yet in the United States, the use of paraquat has actually been increasing. It doubled in use in recent years. It is one of the most widely used agricultural chemicals in America. And what paraquat does at the cellular level is deeply concerning. It is what scientists call a mitochondrial toxicant. Your mitochondria are the energy-producing engines inside your cells, every cell in your body. When paraquat gets into the system, it essentially smothers these mitochondrial engines. It disrupts energy production at the cellular level. Now, why does that hit the brain so hard? Because the brain is the most metabolically demanding organ in your body. The brain is only about 2% of your body weight, but it consumes roughly 30% of your total energy. It is a high-performance, high-energy engine. When you poison the mitochondria, the brain is the first place that feels it. The second pesticide I want to mention is chlorpyrifos, another neurotoxic pesticide, also widely used, also associated with elevated Parkinson's and ALS risk, particularly in agricultural workers and people who work in landscaping and green spaces. So what do you do with this information? A few practical things. First, if you play golf, or your family members do, please stop licking your golf balls to clean them. I know it sounds like a strange thing to mention, but people do this all the time. The surface of a golf ball that has rolled across a treated fairway is coated in pesticide residue. Don't put it in your mouth. Second, wash your golf shoes and your clothing immediately after playing. These pesticides don't just stay on the grass. They transfer to whatever contacts the surface. Your shoes track them into your car, into your home, onto your floors. Third, find out when the course you play on sprays their pesticides. Most courses have a schedule. Stay away during and immediately after spraying windows. And if you live near any agricultural area, not just golf courses, these same considerations apply. Farm fields, orchards, vineyards. The chemical exposure from proximity to these areas is real and documented. And that brings me to truth number 5. And I want to end on this one because I think it is both the most sobering and the most empowering of all of them. Prevention is going to be a policy, not a pill. We have a tendency in medicine, and honestly, in culture broadly, to think that the answer to every disease is going to come in the form of a drug, a pharmaceutical intervention. We're waiting for the Parkinson's cure to come out of a lab somewhere. And I'm not dismissing that research. It is important and it is ongoing. But here's the truth. We already know enough to dramatically reduce the burden of this disease. We just have to be willing to act on that knowledge. Let me give you a historical parallel that I find incredibly encouraging. Before the 1970s, leaded gasoline was ubiquitous. Lead was pouring out of the exhaust pipes of every car on every road in America. Lead is one of the most potent neurotoxins known to science, and it was essentially being vaporized into the air that everyone breathed. We removed lead from gasoline, and blood lead levels in Americans dropped dramatically. It was one of the great public health victories of the 20th century. We fixed the ozone layer by banning chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs. That was a policy decision. We cleaned the air in cities like Los Angeles so dramatically that the smog of the 1960s and 70s is almost unrecognizable compared to today. These were policy decisions. They required political will and some short-term economic disruption. And they worked. If we banned paraquat, truly banned it, the way 30 other countries have, and if we phased out TCE, trichloroethylene, from industrial use, we could, over the coming decades, return Parkinson's disease to the rarity it was in 1817. That is not a fantasy. That is a realistic, achievable public health goal. Now, in the meantime, because policy moves slowly, what can you do individually? Number 1, upgrade your water filtration. If you are using a standard carbon filter, that's a good start, but it is not sufficient for removing all the concerning chemicals. Reverse osmosis filtration is significantly more effective at removing VOCs, pesticides, and industrial chemicals from drinking water. It's worth the investment. Number 2, upgrade your air filtration. HEPA filters are excellent for particulate matter, but for chemical contaminants like TCE, you want a filter that also includes an activated carbon stage, sometimes called a carbon filter stage. That combination captures both particles and volatile organic compounds. Number 3, wash your produce. And I mean really wash it. The government's standard for measuring pesticide safety on produce is based on a 20-second wash, so match that at minimum. A solution of salt water or diluted white vinegar is more effective than plain water for removing surface pesticide residues. And there's something broader I want to talk about, which is this concept of your overall toxic load. Think of it like a bucket. Your body has mechanisms for dealing with toxins, your liver, your kidneys, your immune system. But those mechanisms have a capacity limit. If you're being exposed to toxins constantly from multiple directions, your air, your water, your food, your cleaning products, your personal care products, eventually the bucket overflows, and that's when disease begins to take hold. The goal isn't to live in a sterile bubble. That's not realistic, and frankly, some environmental exposures are unavoidable. The goal is to reduce your total load as much as you reasonably can, so your body's natural defenses can do their job. There's also a cellular process called autophagy, which is essentially the body's internal garbage disposal system. Your cells have a mechanism for cleaning up damaged proteins, including misfolded ones. Things like intermittent fasting, regular exercise, and reducing caloric excess can support autophagy. You're essentially giving your cells the tools they need to take out their own trash.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join the journey.
So let me bring this all together. Parkinson's disease is not a mystery. It is not random. It is not simply the inevitable decay of an aging brain. It is an industrial disease, driven by environmental toxins that we have introduced into our air, our water, and our food supply over the past 2 centuries. It begins in the body, in the gut, in the nose, sometimes decades before it ever reaches the brain. It announces itself through early warning signs that most people and most doctors are not trained to recognize. It is accelerated by chemicals that we know are dangerous and continue to use anyway. And it is preventable. The hopeful truth, and I want you to leave today with the hopeful truth, is that we've done this before. We've reversed environmental crises before. We have the knowledge. We have the technology. What we need is the collective will to act on it. In the meantime, each of you has agency. You can filter your water. You can wash your produce carefully. You can pay attention to the early warning signs in yourself and the people you love. You can push for policy change, support organizations advocating for pesticide bans. You can talk about this, because awareness is where all change begins. If this video was helpful to you, please share it with someone you care about. Subscribe if you haven't already. We go deep on this kind of functional medicine science every week. And drop a comment below. Have you or someone you love experienced any of these early warning signs? I read every comment and I'd love to hear from you. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other.